This is a Film Stories original podcast.
A friend of mine worked at the British Film Institute, and he was standing next to Richard Attenborough, who was then chairman of the British Film Institute, and a phone call came through, I imagine from an Italian production company, saying, would you be interested in resurrecting this? You've made a bridge too far. You are the man to make the Siege of Leningrad. And Attenborough put his hand over the receiver and turned to this guy and said, who's Leone? Never heard of him.
No.
And, you know, it's a different film culture. It's a different world.
This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello everybody and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale. I'm a writer and film critic, and today I am absolutely over the moon to be joined by someone whose work I have read and followed for years and years, Sir Christopher Frayling. Thank you so much, Christopher, for joining me.
Well, no, I'm delighted. I'm looking forward to it.
I've been a huge fan of Sergio Leone, and I've moved to Italy. And I've lived here for 25 years, but my fandom goes back to being a child, really. I remember watching the spaghetti westerns as a kid on television. What was your first experience of Sergio Leone?
It was in Cambridge, where I was at university, in summer of 1967. And they have this tradition in Cambridge of a thing called a May Ball, which actually takes place in June, which gives you some idea about Cambridge. Anyway, the May Ball, which took place in June, is an all-night ball, lots of dancing, and Georgie Fame and the Blue Flames, there's a name to conjure with. Anyway, he was top of the bill, and I had a terrible row with my girlfriend at about 3 a.m. And so by sort of dawn, both of us were really feeling no pain at all. It was just awful, and I drifted into town, and I drifted into the cinema, and just after lunchtime, what should come on but A Fistful of Dollars. And I was completely blown away. And in those days, you could sit there and watch the program through. I watched it through 3 times without leaving the cinema, and no separate performances in those days. And so I started reading reviews. I hadn't read anything about it, and I couldn't understand why people hadn't sort of got the point. I mean, the visuals, the Spanish location, the costumes, the larger-than-life production design, the amazing music, Fender Stratocaster guitar, and chorus singing incomprehensible lyrics was so much more hip than the kind of symphonic Eastern European type symphonic music you tended to get in classic Hollywood westerns. And so that's the visual side, but also the thematic side, the cynicism just hit the spot. I mean, we're in summer 1967. We've all got Che Guevara posters on the wall. We're all listening to Bob Dylan, The Times They Are A-Changin', with God on our side. So Vietnam demonstrations are just beginning. And this idea that you didn't have to believe in the Gospel of John Wayne to enjoy a Western. You could actually enjoy a Western which had a completely different view of the wild, much more cynical view of the Wild West, which is basically that everybody's on the take. Why are you doing this for us? $500? Anyway, all of it just hit the spot. So it became a bit of a crusade to try and persuade other people to take these films seriously. And then, for all sorts of complicated reasons to do with copyright, the other 2 films came out very quickly afterwards. Whereas A Fistful of Dollars had been originally released in 1964, for a few dollars more in 1965, and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly in 1966 in Italy, because of a slight misunderstanding with Akira Kurosawa, who correctly claimed that his film Yojimbo was the origin of Fistful of Dollars. The American studios were worried about Fistful of Dollars, didn't want to touch it until that was sorted. That was sorted by 1967, but by then the other 2 films were ready. So they came out very quickly. Fistful of Dollars, Few Dollars More, Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, with a few months in between, and a continuous publicity campaign. The man with no name is coming. The man with the cigarillo is coming. The man with the long gun is coming. Bum. And so by the time I was getting used to writing about these and persuading, the second film came out, and then the third, and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly clinched it for for me. I thought this was an amazing film because it not only took on, as it were, the traditional Western, but it took on the American Civil War. It took on other wars as well, that deliberately you've got trench warfare of the First World War, you've got references to the Second World War. It was a big, big statement. And by then we're all reading Catch-22 by Joseph Heller, which is also about the absurdity of war, the Second World War. It absolutely hit the spot. And in 1968, I went on a Greyhound bus across America. In those days, you could get through the Students' Union a ticket, $49.99, which took you from New York and back again across America, so long as you only took a month. So New York, Chicago, time. I got to San Francisco and I went to an all-nighter of Leone's films in San Francisco. And the sweet smell of success was wafting in the cinema, as you can imagine. Most of the audience consisted of draft dodgers and alternatives of various descriptions. And they watched the film. And then when it got to The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, there's a moment where Clint Eastwood looks at the Battle of the Bridge and says, "I've never seen so many men wasted so badly." And the place erupted. This was the moment. They just got it. That kind of a little bit of a twinkle in the eye, but a cynicism about war and so on, just hit the spot. Summer 68, San Francisco. So not only in Italy and Europe, but in America too, it had hit the button. So this became a bit of a crusade, and I seem to specialize in my writings in despised genres. If it isn't Hammer films or Gothic literature, which in those days was absolutely beyond the pale. Now it's unbelievably fashionable, but in those days beyond the pale. And then spaghetti westerns. There's something psychological. I have this slight psychological thing of if everybody else hates it, I'm jolly well going to persuade them to take things a little bit more. And one thing led to another. So I did the biography of Leone. I did an exhibition at the Autry Museum in 2004, of which I did the catalogue, etc. And I sort of became his champion in a way. Because even then, although his final film, Once Upon a Time in America, certain esteem in Italy had lost, even then, he was a prophet without honour in his own country. Serious filmmakers make movies about Italy. Serious filmmakers make movies about Italy which are shown at international festivals. Unserious filmmakers make westerns, gangster films, which aren't shown at international festivals and which have half an eye on the box office. So he was treated as kind of second 11. He's not quite there amongst the great filmmakers. And that annoyed me. So it became another crusade to say, well, hang on a minute, maybe Visconti is a bit overrated. Come on. Maybe it's actually better at telling stories than Visconti was, but we won't go into that. And so on. Anyway, so that's how it happened. And there may be some deep, because I'd had a row with my girlfriend in Cambridge, because I was feeling really down, and because this film was a kind of liberation in all sorts of ways, and maybe there's a fairly deep personal reason for why I've been so attached to these films ever since.
There's an amazing quote that you have in your new book, Sergio Leone by himself, in which he says, he's asked about who do you think is overrated, and he says, overrated, underrated, I leave that to the critics.
Yes, exactly. And he has this rather marvellous answer in one of his interviews that I've got in the book, where they say, where do you think you fit in film history? And he says, somewhere on the same page as Kubrick and Kurosawa in a dictionary. It's KL, I'll be just after the Ks. It doesn't say at all. It's a great answer, I think. And I hope he is in the film dictionaries after K.
Let's talk a little bit about Leone himself and his background, because, I've read your biography, and I've absolutely great to revisit sort of that biography via this book, and such a handsome book, so many beautiful illustrations. The cover itself is wonderful. So Leone comes from a cinema family, essentially. His father, a film director.
Yes, and actor. His father was called Vincenzo Leone, but because in those days it wasn't very respectable to become an actor, and it certainly wasn't respectable to join the fledgling film industry, he changed his name to Roberto Roberti. So he had a kind of pseudonym, or nome d'arte, as they call it. His mother was an actress in silent films, Edvige Valcarenghi, who called herself, again, a pseudonym, Bice Valoran. And they worked together, that Vincenzo Leone and his bride-to-be actually worked together in 1913 on a film called La Vampira Indiana, the Indian vampire, which some say is the first Italian Western. I'm afraid I dispute that. The first Italian Western was written by Puccini. It's the opera, The Girl of the Golden West, around about 1910, which premiered at the Met in New York, which was the world's first real spaghetti Western. But anyway, that's a sort of bit of theology. But so, yeah, I mean, what was interesting was that Vincenzo Leone fell out with the Mussolini regime in the mid-1920s. He was quite senior in the Italian film business by then, chairing the Directors Guild of America. I mean, he was an establishment figure. He falls out with the fascist regime and is on a kind of house arrest. He can't work. He's not allowed to work. So Leone grows up in the 1930s in a household where his mum has retired from the film business when he was born. He was an only child, born very late in the marriage, parents in their 40s. And so he's, you know, a rather a sort of spoiled child, I suspect. His mum retires from the film industry and his dad is under house arrest. So I can imagine the conversation was very much about the world we have lost, you know, about the good old days of silent film when we worked in Turin and Rome on all these great biblical films, or Machiste the Mighty, or whatever the films were. So I think the melancholy that goes very deep in Leone about there was once a Hollywood that's been lost, and if only we can recapture the magic of Hollywood, of my childhood, was probably part of his drinking water when he grew up. You know, there's this atmosphere of melancholy in the household. Neither of his parents are working. Then his dad starts working in the late 30s, early 40s, and Leone, aged 11, stumbles onto a film stage, sees his father at work, a film called Bocca sulla Strada, Mouth on the Road, and, you know, gets religion, decides, if he claimed, it never quite happens like this, but he had his Damascus Road experience on a soundstage. I don't want to be a lawyer. I don't want to be an accountant. Of course, his dad wanted him to be an accountant or a lawyer. I want to work in the film business. So he goes to college, but seems to sort of drop out and ends up as an extra in De Sica's film, The Bicycle Thieves. If you look very closely at The Bicycle Thieves, there's a scene where they're in a marketplace in Rome, it's pouring with rain, and there's a bunch of rather improbable-looking young priests, seminarians, trainee priests, standing underneath the gutter trying to hide from the rain, and the one with the glasses, who looks the most improbable of all, is played by the young Sergio Leone. And from then on, he was in the film business. So what's particularly interesting is that Leone's children, Raffaella particularly, and the others in the family, have set up Leone Film Limited, which is in business as a distributor in Rome today, but also now increasingly moving into production. So I think it's a unique example in the Italian and possibly world cinema of the grandparents were in the movies, the sons are in the movies, and the next generation is also in other words, an unbroken dynasty for over a century within Italian film. And I think that's extraordinary, really. And so film, yeah, I mean, as Leone said, you know, that his life, his reading, everything was in the cinema. He grew up in a cinema almost, and really couldn't tell the difference between the cinema and real life because he'd spent so much time. It was in the genes, really. And I don't know if you've been to the Pordenone Silent Film Festival, which is an annual film festival in Rome for celebrating silent film and the restoration of silent films. There was a famous moment where Leone and his wife were taken to Pordenone, and they showed as a feature one of Vincenzo Leone's films, Consuelita, but they then showed a series of fragments of Italian films that they couldn't identify, and one of them had Vincenzo on it, and Leone stood up, "That's my dad! That's my dad!" It's a great moment at Pordenone, and he didn't know which film it was, but he knew it was his dad.
That's wonderful. And I love the quote in the book as well, where it says, where I think he says it a couple of times, that he thought his father invented cinema.
Yes, exactly. And the story's got a little bit taller. Leone was latterly quite a Falstaffian sort of figure. I mean, the story's improved in the telling. And one of the challenges of writing his biography, and indeed of his collected writings in the latest book, is to try and sort of triangulate a little bit. In other words, you look at two other people's version of the same story, if you can, because you might roughly get the truth in the middle between all these different people, movie people alike. They tell taller and taller stories. And so, Leone used to say, my dad discovered Machiste the Mighty as a docker and put him into the movies and made, well, yes, I mean, he did make a Machiste film, the third one in the cycle, but it is highly unlikely that he discovered, etc. So it always gets amplified a little bit. He liked entertaining his audience by making everything a little bit more spectacular, like his movies. So he pumps up the stories, and you have to divide them by two sometimes.
And so he begins with, he turns up in Bicycle Thieves by De Sica. He is really gets a boost from the American money, the old Hollywood on the Tiber situation, where he talks about Himalaya of soldi of money just hanging around for him to.
I know. Yes, I mean his apprenticeship is partly, as you say, with the Americans, with Quo Vadis, Helen of Troy, Ben-Hur, the Nun story. He worked on all of them because it's what they called frozen dollars. That if an American film earned a lot of money in Italy, the way to avoid having it taxed punitively was to spend it in Italy. You didn't have it taxed they recycle these frozen dollars, which is why you get these huge bloated epics where they kind of build the chariot race arena at Cinecittà in Rome and all the rest of it. It's spending frozen dollars that otherwise would be sent to the treasury. So he works on those, but in parallel, and he always thought this was rather underrated, he worked also for jobbing Italian filmmakers. Mario Camerini, who's one of them, was his godfather. His father, although he disapproved of his son going into the film business, introduced him into various networks of people of that generation, 1920s, 30s filmmakers. And so he works quite a lot in the 1950s with these veteran Italian filmmakers at the same time as working for the Americans. But he always said, when he was working for the Americans, he works for Robert Aldrich on Sodom and Gomorrah. Bad experience. He might have got fired. He might have walked. We're not quite sure. There are two versions of that story. But he works for Robert Aldrich. He works for Robert Wise on Helen of Troy. He works for William Wyler on Ben-Hur, Frinneman on the Nun story. And he says, I kept trying to talk to them about the Western, and they kept saying to me, the Western's dead, come on, it's yesterday's event. Television's taken over the Western, it's become a huge cliche, nobody can make a Western. He was really frustrated. He said, I spend my life, in front of papier-mâché Greek columns and all the rest of it, and all I wanted to do was talk about Westerns.
Yeah, and there was this sense as well of post-war, he coming from an anti-fascist family, his father's career has to some extent been forestalled and wrecked by the fascist regime. And then you also have the fact that American movies, American culture is kind of limited. So it's suddenly the floodgates are open and he's suddenly receiving all this. So that's maybe as well an influence in him wanting
incredible. Absolutely. I mean, whenever Leone talked about Once Upon a Time, he partly meant an autobiographical Once Upon a Time. When he was a child, he would watch Hollywood movies on the big screen in Trastevere, which is a kind of suburb of Rome. Only they were dubbed into Italian. And also, only certain films were allowed to be shown. So the regime, very strangely, for example, with Chaplin, no to The Great Dictator, for obvious reasons, but yes to Modern Times, which is actually quite socialist in its message. But anyway, Mussolini loved time, so everyone goes to see Modern Times. In the case of Frank Capra, no to Mr. Deeds Goes to Town. Sorry, no to Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, but yes to Mr. Deeds Goes to Town, which is all about small town America. So films get through. Most gangster films didn't get through. Although Leone always said he watched all these gangster films when he was a kid, he can't have. They were not shown in the 1930s, largely because gangsters in Hollywood tended to be Italian. Tony Camonte in Scarface, or Caesar Ricabadillo in Little Caesar, usually played by Jewish actors, but they were supposed to be Italian. And Mussolini said this is denigrates the Italian nation, so all those gangster movies were banned, so he can't have seen them, actually. But they all appeared, as you say, between about 1945 and 1951, an avalanche of American films, including the back numbers, including all the film noir, which had been building up throughout the 1940s, all appear at the same time. Leone claimed he went to the cinema 3 times a day, regularly, just catching up. And it was a kind of indigestion, visual indigestion. I think it's the same thing happens to the French New Wave filmmakers, you know, the Cahiers du Cinema mob in Paris. They also recalled how all these cinema clubs were popping up just to cope with the back numbers that were pouring out of Hollywood because they hadn't been able to see them under the Nazi occupation in the case of Paris, you know. So, yes, so once upon a time, a child in the 1930s, once upon a time, a budding assistant director being submerged by all these American movies. And once upon a time, you know, he saw the magic of these traditional Hollywood genres, but felt they'd lost it. You know, it had become too talky in the 1950s. Hollywood had discovered Freud, and as Leone once said, you know, at a film like The Left-Handed Gun, if there'd been a social worker around, Billy the Kid would never have happened, which is slightly missing the point. But, you know, that Hollywood heroes become problems to be solved by psychoanalysis rather than good old heroes, action heroes. So part of his thing was, you know, what have they done to the Western? What has Hollywood done to the Western? As the critic Pauline Kael said, you know, by the mid-1960s, the sole interest in the Hollywood Western is whether John Wayne can still get on a horse. The only reason people go to the pictures is to see whether the old boy can still manage to get on a horse or not. Well, by the time it's got to that stage, it was an old... Yes, there was The Magnificent Seven, which was a youthful film and introduced various new stars to the firmament, but mostly the Western was old men like Wayne, Stewart, Gary Cooper, and it had got old with the stars who grew up with it really since the 1920s. So it was absolutely ready for an injection of something youthful, something different. What no one anticipated was that came from Italy. You know, that injection of youthfulness and so on didn't come from in Hollywood. Well, in some ways it came from Japan.
He has, again, the various stories about this, because he has the idea that, actually it's Red Harvest, actually it's Goldoni.
Exactly.
So why is he just sort of looking for a story and that's a convenient story and I can translate it? Or is he thinking, well, it's an Eastern and the Eastern is just a Western that hasn't gone far enough?
I think you know, he went to, and in fact, for the latest book, I managed to track down the newspaper ad for, talk about, you know, the blood group of the horses. This is very detailed stuff, but I tracked down the advertisement for Yojimbo when Leone went to see it at the Arlecchino Cinema in Rome. He goes to see it, and I think 2 things happen. One thing, he realizes that Kurosawa owes a lot to the traditional Western, that those samurai films, The Seven Samurai, Yojimbo, and Sanjuro, are a kind of Japanese take on the grammar of the traditional Western, turned into medieval Japan. So he twigged that, but also he twigged, why don't we send it back, that this would make a great Western. That there's something about the footloose samurai played by Toshiro Mifune, who goes into town, realizes there's money to be made. He sells himself to the silk merchants, to the sake merchants. He sets them against each other and watches the mayhem from a bell tower and then just cleans up. Wouldn't that make a great Western? It wouldn't make a great John Wayne Western, but it could be made. So according to Leone's account, he had that revelation in the cinema. He then went to see it several times with friends and told everyone about it. And they started working on a script immediately. Why they didn't clear the rights, there's all sorts of different versions of why this didn't happen. I mean, and in fact, Leone tells assorted different versions in his interviews. But I think the most likely is that, look, this was a low-budget Italian Western, about $200,000, shot in Spain. It was going to have an audience in southern Italy and maybe in Africa and some other markets, the German market, because they had German actors, that nobody would notice. I think they thought nobody will notice. It'll come, it'll go like lots of other Italian Westerns, and nobody will take a blind bit of notice. Of course, it became an international hit, at which point it got onto everybody's radar. At which point Kurosawa noticed, and in fact, in the book, Sergio Leone by himself actually got the letter where Kurosawa writes. It's a very funny story, actually, that Kurosawa writes on a Tokyo hotel notepaper saying, you know, it's a great movie, but it's my movie. And in recompense, I'll take the distribution rights for basically the Far East, for Formosa, Taiwan, for Japan, and Korea and so on, and Alex, and we'll shake hands on that, and we'll consider honours or even, which he did, and which Kurosawa later said he made more money from A Fistful of Dollars being distributed in the Far East than from any of his own movies. More money than Seven Samurai, more money than Ran, more money than, because it was hugely lucrative. It was very, very successful, particularly in Japan. But the funny thing was, when Leone got this letter, he was in his office, and he clutched it, and he rushed round to everyone and said, "I've got a letter from Kurosawa. It's got his autograph on it. He's actually signed it." And somebody said, "Yes, Sergio, but have you read it?" It's oh yeah, well, never mind. Yeah. So they give the right, and at that point, of course, the Americans can start distributing Leone's films because there's clarity about its origins. It's no longer entangled in any legal problems, and away we go. But so I think that's probably what happened. Leone claimed sometimes he asked the producers to clear the rights, but they refused. Etc. There's many different versions. And then, as you say, there's all these, and Leone says, well, I noticed that Dashiell Hammett wrote a book called Red Harvest, which is based on the Servant of Two Masters plot, which itself is Goldoni in the 18th century. So maybe they should be suing the estate of Mr. Goldoni rather than suing, etc., etc. But I think this was clutching at straws. I think they all knew what they were doing.
I mean, there are shots. You can put a scene by scene comparison.
I mean, there are differences, and I think it's interesting, to tease out what are the Italian bits, because there are very distinct differences. Not the most important is that in Yojimbo you get the sense of another world outside this story, where there's a government inspector looks in, and there's a political system going on, of which this is a part. You get no sense of that in Fistful of Dollars. It's completely isolated from the outside world. This fly-blown San Miguel, this village, you don't get any sense of another world outside. It's very claustrophobic. It's a stage on which the action takes place. That's a big difference, I think.
I remember when I first saw it being very uncertain of what country it was meant to be in. Whether it's, are we in Mexico now, or are we, we're definitely on the border, but I'm not entirely sure we're in America.
No, it's interesting because I was very kindly given by the widow of Carlo Simi, the production designer, an unsung hero of these films, by the way. Everybody writes about Eastwood, Morricone for the music, and Leone, but the fourth member of this team, a key one, is the production designer and costume designer, Carlo Simi. But anyway, his widow gave me a Carlo Simi's personal copy of the script, and there was an opening scene that they shot but they cut, which would have made absolutely clear. It begins with the Clint Eastwood character dressed in a Confederate uniform, riding across the Rio Grande or the Rio Bravo from America, arriving on the other side at the bank. There's a rather overweight Mexican peasant fishing with a poncho lying next to him. A boot comes into shot as Clint Eastwood kicks this peasant into the water, pinches his poncho, leaves his jacket behind, puts on the poncho, boom, the film begins. He rides on a mule into San Miguel. Now, they cut all that because they thought it was too literal, I think. Also, it wasted quite a lot of time. But that would have made absolutely clear. We're just after the American Civil War, or possibly the declining days of the Civil War. This is someone, a loser in the Civil War, crossing the Rio Grande to become a soldier of fortune, a bit like in Vera Cruz and films like that, where you get American soldiers of fortune crossing the river to work for Maximilian or whatever it is, So it would have started, and also that he's utterly ruthless, kicking this peasant and pinching his clothes, and you'd have realised this guy isn't John Wayne anymore. But anyway, that was all cut, and they just with him on a mule. There he is in the desert somewhere, which might be Mexico, it might be Southwest America. And you're right, it is a tiny bit muddling, not least because the actors are German and Spanish. But
Marisol.
Exactly. And they all spoke their own language. I mean, because Italian films are post-synchronized, as you know. Oh, here's another story I can tell you. I mean, years ago, I put up a season of Italian westerns for the British Film Institute on the South Bank at the National Film Theatre. And they wrote this is a long time ago, they wrote a very sniffy letter back saying, we don't show dubbed films. So I wrote back saying, oh, great. In that case, you can't show Visconti, Zeffirelli, Pasolini, Rossellini. All these Italian films are dubbed. They're all post-synchronized. Hollywood did direct sound and were very keen on the realism of sound. Italy always did post-synchronized sound. One of the reasons being that they built Cinecittà, the studios, on the flight path of Fiumicino Airport. So if you're standing outside, they think a plane's going over all the time, so you can't do direct sound. But also, it meant the Italians were quite brilliant at sound design. Because it's like an art form in post-production. You can layer all these sounds because you're dealing with a blank sheet, you know, that's also. So yes. So anyway, the National Film Theatre agreed with me.
I mean, just to make this clear as well to the listeners, when we're talking about Italian movies being dubbed, they weren't necessarily dubbed by the actors playing the characters. I mean, Pasolini films frequently dubbed with different actors. I think the film about Salah is dubbed with an entirely different cast playing the parts to the people you see.
Yes, and in fact, if you watch an Italian print of A Fistful of Dollars, the Clint Eastwood character has a very bass voice. He's quite a bass baritone voice, and he comes over as much more of a heavy, whereas that light Clint Eastwood Californian sort of voice, which is quite sinister in its way. Do you feel lucky? You know, that kind of breathy Californian voice.
The whisper.
It's not there at all. Yeah, it's not there at all. And it's, do you feel lucky? It's very different. So it actually alters the tone of the film quite a lot. No, but you're quite right. There was a whole swathe of Italian actors who earned their living as for dubbing and became quite well known for it, actually, in the industry. Yeah, so when they say they don't show dubbed films, I'm afraid they're excluding the entire Italian film culture, but never mind.
We were talking just then about, you mentioned a couple of times about John Wayne being the sort of the guy who the sun is setting on until the shootist, in which it sets finally.
By that stage, it's become the subject of the movie is that he's dying and the Western genre is dying around him. It's very self-conscious, saying it's the end of an era movie, isn't it? Anyway, sorry. Yeah.
A flatmate of mine, we used to always watch films. We used to have a game where we tried to find a Western that wasn't an end of the West Western, because every Western seemed to be, this is the end of the West, the railroad has arrived, or the wild bunch are dying out.
I know, and sorry, just on that, the Sam Peckinpah can't make up his mind when the West ended. He makes a film like Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, where you get the speech about, the West is that's the 1880s, it's closing in. Then in The Wild Bunch, you get the same speech. Oh, it's 1911 during the Mexican Revolution. Well, I mean, when is the West closing in? But because they were sort of romantic twilight movies, Götterdämmerung movies about the twilight of the gods, it didn't really matter what period they were set in. It was about the twilight of the gods. You're quite right.
It's like Mephistopheles. Wherever I am, the West is ending, and the West is ending wherever I am.
I like that. That's very good. Exactly.
So we have Clint Eastwood, who has been, of course, Rowdy Yates in Rawhide. Where is Eastwood without Leone? I mean, does Eastwood become Eastwood without these films?
Well, it's a very interesting question, because if you look at some of his contemporaries in 1950s TV westerns, some of them become superstars. Steve McQueen via The Magnificent Seven. He was in a series called Wanted, Dead or Alive, where he played a bounty hunter on television. James Garner, Maverick, slower career, but nevertheless becomes a superstar. But then you look at some of the others, Will Hutchins, Sugarfoot, Hugh O'Brien, Whiter, they peter out. Even Ty Hardin, Bronco, tries to make a little bit of a living in Italy, made a couple of westerns in Italy, but it doesn't work. So he could have ended up in a dead end as a TV movie actor who never really made a big career. After the $3 films, Leone, and to a lesser extent Clint Eastwood, but it was there, tended to badmouth each other a bit, as if they kind of resented their own each person's contribution to their success. So Clint Eastwood would say, well, Leone told me the story of Once Upon a Time in the West, and after about an hour he hadn't got beyond the railway station at the beginning of the movie, and I said to him, where on earth is this story going, and so on. So slow, I don't want anything to do with it. That on the one hand. On the other hand, Leone's great line, and it is a great line, about Clint Eastwood was, somebody asked him, it's in the book actually, somebody asked him, what went through your mind when you first met Clint Eastwood in the spring of 1964, when he came from they hadn't met before, when he came from America to to Italy. And Leone sort of paused and said, "It is said that Michelangelo looked at a block of marble and saw Moses. I looked at Clint Eastwood and saw a block of marble," which is a great answer. And I'm sure it was a story he'd honed down, and so on. And then he paused and said, "Which is just what I needed for the movie, a block of marble."
Yeah.
Someone who's completely impassive, doesn't give anything away with his face. Everyone else gives everything away with their faces. He gives away absolutely nothing with his face. But but latterly, Clint Eastwood made his peace with Leone. It's a very touching scene where they had lunch together shortly before Leone died. They shook hands. And Clint Eastwood appeared at the Venice Film Festival and turned to the audience and said, "I owe it all to you." That Italy was the turning point. It actually honed down the persona that he used in all his films after that. This sort of strong, silent, enigmatic, slightly locked-in character who was, with all his physical solutions to every problem and so on, and the way he moved and everything, the coolness of him, everything from, Dirty Harry.
The humor. I mean, there's that scene. I know
it's in his eye.
The twinkle. Yeah. There's a scene in The Fistful of Dollars where it doesn't sound funny when I say it, but it is funny when he punches Marisol in the face by accident, and he looks at the camera. He does almost an Oliver Hardy of looking directly in the camera.
Exactly.
Like, what have I got to live with?
Yeah, and you sometimes get a bit of sort of musical punctuation to just to underline the joke, a kind of exclamation mark.
Yeah,
a musical exclamation mark. No, it's true, and I think, call me biased because I'm a great fan of these movies, but I don't think Clint Eastwood was ever better than he was in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly.
No.
There's something about the way he's directed. He got the humour, he got the irony, he got the toughness, the coolness, all of that in extreme close-up. So every sort of pore of his skin is actually for us to look at and so on. I think it took Clint Eastwood a very long time, if indeed he ever got there, to find a part that he could give so much to, or a director who would get so much from him as Leone did when he made The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. I think it really is his greatest performance. I'm not saying, I love Unforgiven. I love High Plains Drifter, although Leone didn't, by the way. He didn't like High Plains Drifter.
Oh, really? What was his objection?
He said, if I want to read the Old Testament, I'll read the Old Testament. That he saw it as a morality tale about the 7 deadly sins, basically.
Right.
This man comes into town, each of the 7 deadly sins, and then he destroys the town and paints it red and calls it hell and rides off, and he's a kind of supernatural kind of figure. For Leone, there was too much fundamentalist morality in it, although I think he could admire its style. But I don't know what he thought of... he can't have seen Unforgiven. Sorry, forgive me, it was made after he died. But no, it wasn't very... if you wanted to have an interview with Leone, you didn't ask him about Clint Eastwood's films. It wasn't an awfully good idea. Well, to start with, at that stage, I think my time with Leone was in the 1980s, early 1980s, and I think shortly before he died, by 1987, 88, he would have given a different story. But he tended to bristle a bit and thought he was taking too much credit, and etc.
You never found out what he thought about Firefox then?
No. No, I didn't. Or if indeed he saw it.
The thing that I noticed as I was reading your book, there's this wonderful sort of thing where he talks about each film adding a character and each film adding dollars. So it gets more and more money in the budget, but more and more money that the people are seeking. And I started to think about it. This might be a stretch, but I started to think Leone is really like James Joyce in that he never went back. He started with short stories. He then went to a novel. He then went to an epic. And then he went beyond language itself. And okay, forgive me for stretching it, but even Finnegan's Wake begins and ends with the sort of the rolling sentence. And you have the end of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, Clint Eastwood grabbing the poncho and riding off so that he could easily be riding into San Miguel at the beginning of and it all, which makes me really glad that he didn't appear in Once Upon a Time in the West, because that makes that trilogy a complete thing.
Yes, although, the original plan was to have the 3 gunfighters at the station, this fly-blown station, and the train is 2 hours late, and they're bored out of their skulls, and they're trying to kill time in their different ways. He wanted them to be Clint Eastwood, Lee Van Cleef, and Eli Wallach. And according to Leone, Lee Van Cleef and Eli Wallach both agreed. They thought it was a great gag, and they'd be shot before the credits ended, and the movie would begin. But Clint Eastwood didn't see the joke, according to Leone. I'm not sure that happened. happened. I think, well, from Clint Eastwood's account of Leone going to see him about Once Upon a Time in the West, Eastwood thought he was being offered the part of a harmonica.
Right.
He certainly didn't think he was being offered the part of someone who was going to be killed before the end of the credits. But Leone, whether it was suffered in translation, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I personally, I do see this amazing forward movement, and I do like the idea that Once Upon a Time in the West
It's a lovely film.
separates itself from the previous trilogy in that way.
Yes. No, well, I think he'd be incredibly flattered by that. It's interesting, and he was. I mean, as the interviews show in the book, I think he was very conscious of what he was doing, Leone. I mean, he wasn't an intellectual. He was not at his best when he pretended to be an intellectual. He went through a phase in the late 60s where he thought this was the thing to do. So he'd have a sort of very trendy book stuck in his pocket in the hope that the interviewer would notice it and so on. But he was very thoughtful in a craftsman-like way about what he was doing. And in particular, yes, as you say, with how each builds on the other, and he doesn't look back. And even to the point of saying, which I hadn't really thought, that although people think that the Man with No Name is the same character in each of the three films, he's actually very different. That in the first one, he's a sort of soldier of fortune. In the second, he's a bounty hunter professionally. And in the third, he's just wandering around the Southwest collecting reward by doing all sorts of scams. He's a con man. And so there's differences. The other thing that's so interesting is that, of course, in the Italian print and indeed the American print of Fistful of Dollars, he's called Joe. He's not called the Man with No Name, but the publicity people at United Artists, I think this is unique in movie history. The name of the central character was invented by the publicity people of the studio. That United Artists, when they had all three films and they wanted to work out how to market them, the Man with No Name. And what's interesting is that they might have got that from Dashiell Hammett. Dashiell Hammett's
The Continental Op.
Continental Op is the Man with No Name. Yeah. And it is possible that there really was a connection with Dashiell Hammett after all, but it was in the name. So he became the Man with No Name, even though he's called Joe in the first one, Blondie in the third one, and Manco in the middle one. So they didn't even dub away his name, but they called him the Man with No Name. And it's great. It differentiates him from James Bond and all these named people, the Man with No Name.
So and it gives him this fluidity that as you say, he can be these very different people, and yet in essence, it's kind of Clint Eastwood's emerging persona.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, those films are so great, and I think you're right to highlight as well Simi and his contribution, because the look of them, like the makeup on the faces, that sort of. I think you mentioned it's not in this book. I think it's in your Spaghetti Westerns book, that there's, for all its sort of dirt and naturalism and everything, there's actually more makeup on them than there would be in a normal movie.
Oh, yes, very, very much so. And in fact, if you watch high definition versions of these films, which have more definition than they should have, that they intended, you could see the eyeliner, you could see the line of the makeup and all the rest of them. They gave them sunburn. I mean, these were, slightly pallid American actors, New Yorker Eli Wallach, Californian Clint Eastwood, coming over to, so they caked them in sunburn. So they look as though they've been sort of in the glorious sunburnt desert and all this thing for years. They're wearing a lot of makeup. Simi's role is extraordinary. I mean, that the design. I mean, take the opening scene of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. You're this fly-blown sort of shack, a series of wooden shacks in the middle of nowhere, but with a wonderful view of the whole of Almeria. You can see the whole of southern Spain actually in the distance. But you're on the top of a mountain. The wind's blowing, and the doors are smashing, and everything is just a little bit bigger than it should be, and a little bit more extreme. So Simi, I think, and Quentin Tarantino agrees with this very much, that Simi is the unsung hero of those films in those visualizations. But then you discover he did the costumes as well. Yeah. Extremely rare. I think not since Chaplin have you got someone who designed the costumes at the same time as designing the settings. And in Once Upon a Time in the West, someone else came in for Cardinale's costumes, a woman called Mary-Lou Cartenet. But all the other costumes designed by Simi, and all the costumes in the Dollars trilogy designed by Simi. And they're extraordinary when you think about it. They have this kind of comic book panache. You know, somebody arrives on the scene wearing a long leather coat, and you kind of know everything about them without them opening their mouth, through the costume, through the way they hold themselves, through, you know, the prop they have in their hand. And that's Simi. And I think he was a key part of this. I mean, he turned the words on the page into the visual experience in the movie, and was a key part of the core team, I think. And the one film that isn't designed by him, A Fistful of Dynamite, it shows, I think, it doesn't quite have that pizzazz, that panache, that kind of comic book quality to the costumes and the settings. I mean, it's good, but it's almost more realist.
That's one of those. I mean, it's sort of, it is directed by Sergio Leone, although he didn't apparently intend to, as you point out. But it is one of those that I struggle most with. It's the least successful, I think, of his films.
Yes, I think the most, looking back from Once Upon a Time in America, the turning point is that the characters about halfway through cease to be sort of puppets, which they were really in the Dollars trilogy. That they act out their parts. They look great. They're dubbed afterwards, but basically it's a kind of visual experience, and they're like chess pieces being moved around a chessboard by the director. Suddenly, the personality of the characters begins to matter, and that's the relationship between James Coburn and Rod Steiger, where Rod Steiger gets propelled into the Mexican Revolution, becomes a hero despite himself. And Coburn, who has been responsible for this, suddenly takes pity on him and realizes how vulnerable Steiger is. And they're locked into this mutual dependence sort of relationship. That was new for Leone. It actually mattered. And also, actions have consequences. That instead of, you know, you blow something up, you move on to the next scene. No, this has consequences. You blow something up, and the people who were blown up send someone round to massacre your whole family as a reprisal.
Yeah, that's a stunning scene.
Things have consequences. They have consequences, and that's new. You know, there's a sense that it kind of matters. It isn't Tom and Jerry anymore. It isn't, you know, that you're going to shoot someone and they'll get up again. It kind of matters, and that leads you towards the darkness of Once Upon a Time in America, I think, where you know, throughout the film, De Niro is kind of sleepwalking into a dark tunnel, and everything has consequences. So I think from that point of view, it's a kind of transitional movie. But I agree, it's not nearly so pleasurable as the other films. It's not so much humor either. It's lost a bit of that twinkle in its eye, I think.
That's a really interesting point, and I think you've put the absolute sort of pin on the donkey's nose. I got halfway through that expression. Yeah, exactly. I got through that expression, didn't know where I was going there. Not so much a mixed metaphor as just one created out of whole cloth. So I was, but this expresses it perfectly. It's the sense that in the original trilogy, it's huge fun, and the deepest you get in terms of emotion is him saying, you know, after a good meal, I like to share a cigar, and that's like as close as they get to actually sharing something human. Whereas as soon as you're in Once Upon a Time in the West, and then Fistful of Once Upon a Time in Revolution, Fistful of Dynamite, and then Once Upon a Time in America, then it all becomes more human. It's like Jill turns up thinking, I'm going to have a new start, I'm going to have a family, and finds a massacre. All of these human relationships become, and sort of story becomes different. All the stories in the first trilogy are like puzzles, and in the second trilogy, the story is sort of out of control. It's no longer...
Yes, and also an increasing melancholy, an increasing darkness. Instead of fun and games and noisy banditos and everyone shooting in all directions and gags, gallows humor, which runs through the trilogy hugely. Instead of that, there's an increasing melancholy. I think this thing that Bertolucci, when I interviewed him, Bernardo Bertolucci, about the conversations he had with Leone, preparing the story of Once Upon a Time in the West, he said what was extraordinary was you've got this strange mixture with Leone of someone who's almost childlike in his interest in the Western, but someone who's got the melancholia of a Visconti as well, about the world we have lost and darkness and not being able to find a way through it in the contemporary world and all these things. He found a darkness in Leone that he hadn't expected, which allied with this childlike quality, which is the excitement, the pizzazz, and, a movie buff, the cineast. It's a kind of cineast, but a very melancholy one. So I think the film that's nearest to Leone's last three films is Visconti's The Leopard in that way. It's all about, an aristocratic Southern society in Italy, which is no longer there, and there's a huge melancholy about the world we have lost. And in Visconti's case, it's an aristocrat looking at, and in Leone's case, it's a movie buff looking at Hollywood for the world we have lost. Not a real world, it's a world of entertainment, a world of cinema. But I think there are analogies, and that's what Bertolucci saw. He said he came on like Visconti, which is quite, and that was a bit of a surprise. The other thing, of course, about Once Upon a Time in the West was how radical it was when you think about it. I mean, Leone's scriptwriters on the trilogy were, well-known Italian scriptwriters who'd made a lot of comedies and adventure films and so on at Cinecittà in the south of Italy, pitched at the south of Italy. But when it comes to Once Upon a Time in the West, he decides to go for two avant-garde film people. Bertolucci, who'd made a couple of films but whose career was in the doldrums, a young Turk in avant-garde, he knew, and who then was a film critic on Paese 7, the Rome evening newspaper, who'd said nice things about Leone's films and was, to his fingertips, a film buff. And actually turning to those two, he'd never written a film script, Argento, turning to those two and saying, let's take another look and see if we can re-energize this from a completely new direction. You're quite right. It's cutting loose from the first three films in a very conscious way. It made his regular film scriptwriters utterly fed up. They thought they'd been betrayed by him by moving towards these young Turks. But you can tell it just moves in a completely different direction, in the direction of the new wave, in a way. I mean, I think that if you look at the new wave in France, you've got Claude Chabrol, right? The book of Hitchcock makes all his movies are basically riffs on Hitchcock. Godard writes for Cahiers du Cinema about monogram studios and B-movies in Hollywood, Nicholas Ray and so on, and he dedicates Breathless to Monogram, the studios. Bertolucci with film noir, etc. I think you can add Leone to that. Jean-Pierre Melville, the same with gangster movies in Hollywood. That, they're fascinated by Hollywood, but they want to take it in a new direction. I think you could add Leone to that pantheon and say, from 68 onwards, he's doing the same with John Ford. He's taking a look at John Ford and saying, let's revisit that corpus of work and see what we can do with it in a post-1968 direction. So I think he belongs to that moment in European cinema where they discover Hollywood and they're unsatisfied by it, but they love it and they want to take it in a new direction.
It's almost like essayists of film.
Yes, exactly.
Once Upon a Time in the West is an essay about the film baddie, Henry Fonda.
Yes, exactly.
The stagecoach ride. It's all these moments that are so...
I know. In fact, someone who put it very well was the philosopher Umberto Eco. I did an interview with him for Britain's Radio 3 many years ago. And I asked him about Once Upon a Time in the West. He said, if a film has one archetype in it, you think it's kitsch. If every character in the film is an archetype, it becomes art. Because suddenly the whole film is in inverted commas. And that's Once Upon a Time in the West. Everything's an archetype of wonder. And the casting, as you say, Ford brings all his movies with him. In the opening scene, Woody Strode brings all John Ford's movies, Sergeant Rutledge, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, he brings them with him. And very consciously, you're saying, the audience will expect him to behave in a certain way because they know this guy's movies. Oh my God, he's not doing that at all. And that keeps them on their toes. And it is a kind of critical cinema, not a phrase that Leone liked, actually, but I tend to call it that, where you're taking Hollywood, you're critiquing Hollywood at the same time as loving it. It's a sort of love-hate thing going on. And also, they knew their films very well. I mean, when I interviewed Leone, he was quite extraordinary in the way he described. There were two scenes that he described to me. One was from Stagecoach, 1939, John Ford, the entrance of John Wayne, where John Wayne's standing there with his rifle, and he famously twiddles it, with the rifle guard.
He sawed off himself in order to be able to do that,
Exactly. And he's the Ringo Kid and all the rest of it. And he described every shot of that You've got medium close-up, you've got close-up, it's a process shot, he's not really in Monument Valley, amazing visual literacy, encyclopedic knowledge, actually. And the other scene he described to me was the scene from Shane, George Stevens' Shane, 50s movie, outside the Grafton store, where Jack Palance puts on one black glove and shoots Elisha Cook Jr., who takes several steps backwards and falls into the mud. And Leone said that was the moment where I suddenly realized what it is to be on the receiving end of a bullet from a Colt gun. You don't fall forward, bang, bang, you're dead. It's very messy, and the main street is messy as well. And he described every moment, not the dialogue, because, of course, when he first saw these films, they were all in Italian. But the visuals, he absolutely had committed to memory the visual grammar of those films. It was quite extraordinary. And without prompting, in the middle of an interview, it was like reading a shooting script, only he was describing it. Now, this man had a great kind of film education. I don't know about other forms of education, but a visual education, very strong indeed.
How did you find meeting Leone after, because you met him after writing spaghetti westerns, right?
I did. I met him first of all in London, then in Italy. In London, well, it was an amazing moment. I mean, I was doing a seminar at the Royal College of Art where I worked, and the phone rang, and it was Leone's interpreter, a man called Brian Frayling, who phoned up and said, Leone's in town, he's at the Dorchester Hotel, he wants to meet you. And I, Jesus, amazing. And I said, yeah. He said, well, he says that in your book, Spaghetti Westerns, you have lots of material about his father, Vincenzo Leone, Roberto Roberti, that he didn't know. And he wants to talk to you about how on earth you found out about these things about his father. So I said, well, delighted. When? Meet this evening. So we met in the bar of the Dorchester. And I mentioned this in the book, actually. He did something I've never seen anybody else do. There was a bowl of cashew nuts on the bar and nibbles. And he grabbed hold of the bowl in one big paw of a hand, chucked it towards his face, and the entire contents of this bowl went into his mouth. I mean, several packets of cashew nuts, and they were all over his beard and all over his shirt, and he was chomping away. So the early part of the interview was him chomping away on cashew nuts. This man had big appetites. Right. He was very round. He wasn't very tall. He was built like Orson Welles, a man of big appetite, loved his food, loved very fine wines, loved double Corona cigars, Havana cigars, and all of that. He was bon vivant, really. And very genial, very slightly defensive. I think he'd been hit by critics so often that his starting position was, I bet this guy's going for me. And so he was rather defensive to start with. And then he realized that I wasn't going to trip him up, and I was just interested in finding out about the background. And at the end of the interview, he said, it took an Englishman to take my film seriously. I loved that. I think I want that on my gravestone, actually. No. But it was a lovely thing to say. And because in Italy, he really was this prophet without honor. I've looked at the book. The review that really stung him, which I've transcribed in the book, is from a fellow filmmaker called Mario Soldati. Mario Soldati was a director for whom Leone had worked as an assistant in the 1950s. And Soldati wrote a review of Fistful of Dollars that is excoriating. He just pulls it apart. But more than that, he's ad hominem. He writes about Leone saying, this guy grew up in the film business, he's uneducated, he's uncultured, he's unintellectual. This guy ought to go away and find something to make movies about, because what he's doing is just making an American Western. Ooh, really, really excoriating review. And I think because it was written by a colleague, that must have hurt, really must have hurt, I think. I mean, it's one thing for, daily newspapers to go for you, but for somebody who's worked with you, who knew you socially, and who had been one of your mentors in the 1950s, to actually do that from a great height, I think made him rather defensive. Yeah. And as I say, it wasn't till once upon a time in America that Italian critics, as a consensus, really began. And then, of course, they went back over the early films and revisited them and said, oh, actually, they're rather great, which amused Leone mightily. He said, yeah, it's about bloody time, You could have said that in 1964, but you're saying it in 1983, But no, so he was this rather larger-than-life. He liked telling tall tales. He was Falstaffian, but he was most at home when talking about the craft. And I think it's a little bit like, and I wouldn't compare myself, but it's a little bit like Truffaut and Hitchcock, that Truffaut asked all these highly intellectual questions about Hitchcock's films, but his answers tend to be about the craft, about, yes, we used a lamp like this, we cut it like this, we used these cameras, we made it at Elstree, this actor had a very particular, so he answers from the point of view of a maker, of an artisan of film. But Truffaut keeps trying to cast him in the role of an intellectual of film. And I think the same with Leone, really. He wasn't at home. If I said high-blown things about, the bell tower in Fistful of Dollars, does this relate to Renaissance history of bell tower patriotism? He'd clam up. He wouldn't know he wouldn't know what to say. But if I said, the use of Morricone's music in a particular sequence and the sound editing, and so on, he was off. He could talk at some length. So he wasn't an intellectual, but he was a very self-conscious filmmaker. And he had this very strong visual education, as I say. If you went to his house, there was a Goya print on the wall. There was a Miro. There were all sorts of drawings, fine art drawings. He was a collector of fine art. And in the book, I've tried to put side by side with key scenes in his films the paintings which inspired them. So De Chirico, of whom he owned 2 paintings, is very like some scenes in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. The Italian surrealist, Giorgio De Chirico, you put that side by side. And in fact, the director of photography, Tonino Delicoli, remembers Leone showing him a De Chirico postcard, saying, I want it to look like that. So, there's a connection between the paintings and the film. And Degas, famously, for the wonderful scene in Once Upon a Time in America, where the teenage Deborah is dancing, and Noodles looks at her through a spy hole, and she's dancing to this wind-up gramophone, Amapola, bum, 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 all that is like a Degas painting, and lit like a Degas. So he knew what he was doing visually. He absolutely, and even his worst enemies, even his scriptwriters who were thoroughly fed up with him for being disloyal and not acknowledging their contribution, even they all say this guy had an astonishingly sophisticated visual imagination and visual knowledge. And I think that's the truth of it, really. And he shouldn't have pretended to be this great intellectual. He thought he should use lots of long words and things. It didn't work.
When we get to Once Upon a Time in America as well, which unfortunately is his last film, and even though he was planning on the Siege of Leningrad as his next one, this again it feels like it's much bigger than its previous films. It feels like it's yet another sort of reinvention. And it's interesting what you were saying about how he's such a craftsman, because when he's talking about his working with De Niro, there's a sense that De Niro's method, if you like, although there's a lot of sort of misunderstanding about that word, but his method, Leone really doesn't have much time for that sort of stuff. He's just like, no, we're going to play any of your Morricone music and you'll get into the mood and everything.
Exactly. And Leone claims that De Niro, to start with, rather resented having them, because the music was all written in advance and recorded with a small orchestra, and it's played on the set on an open reel tape recorder. I've got photographs of that in Once Upon a Time in the West to create the atmosphere. And to start with, De Niro resented that, according to Leone. This isn't a silent movie. I don't need sound effects to get a performance out. But then he began to really warm to the idea, until latterly he really enjoyed. I want the music to get myself into the mood, so they'd play the music and then, of course, cut it for the actual take. Because some of Once Upon a Time in America is direct sound, and they couldn't have music playing in the background. They'd have picked up on it. So I think he came round to Leone's rather eccentric way of directing, which was partly to mime. When the Dollars trilogy was made, Leone scarcely spoke English. I think he spoke English more than he pretended, but he scarcely spoke English. So he had this great phrase, watch me, Clint. Watch me, Hank. Watch me, Eli. Watch me, Lee. And he'd act out the part for them. I want you to do this, and then he'd act it out for someone else. And then he'd play the music. And so a mixture of him miming it and the music to get the atmosphere was his way of directing. And in the process, I think he sort of Italianized all the characters. he turned them into him. So Clint Eastwood comes over as originally as the ramrod on a never-ending cattle drive in Rawhide, and he turns into a Roman villain. He becomes that because he watches all this miming that's going on. By the time of Once Upon a Time in America, Leone spoke more English and had more respect for actors, I think, and their contribution. And he knew that if De Niro hadn't signed up, the movie wouldn't have got made. Right. It wasn't like the others, where they'd have happened even if Clint Eastwood wasn't in them. But this would not have happened if it hadn't been for De Niro, and it hadn't been for the producer Arne Milchan bumping into him at the Cannes Film Festival. And so I think he had more respect. And in fact, at his auditions, De Niro sitting next to him at the auditions and helping him to say, I think we should take that actor. I don't think we should. So he's actually consulting his lead actor. That was very new. With Once Upon a Time in America. So I think he had a lot more respect by then for actors. I mean, what's extraordinary about his career is that, 6 movies, basically, if we discount The Colossus of Rhodes, all right, 7. And he turns down all these, he's offered The Godfather. He's offered this, he's offered that. And he doesn't want to make a movie that he hasn't thought of, that he hasn't grown himself, because he can't identify. He can't do directing as a job of work for someone else. He has to have grown he really is an author from that point of view, I think. We often use the auteur sort of label. I think he really was that he was extremely uncomfortable working from anybody else's material apart from his own. So he turns out, and I've done a list of all the
What did Robert Aldrich do to you?
I know. God, I mean, that's someone ought to make a movie about that, sitting in Morocco and trying to make Sodom and Gomorrah as an assistant director. And then Aldrich claimed he fired Leone because Leone was taking 4-hour lunch hours and everyone was sitting around, and half the Moroccan army was just sitting there eating sandwiches and costing tens of thousands of dollars. So he fired his sequence quite quickly. I got so fed up with the profligacy of the production where everyone was wasting money left, right and centre. He thought, sod this, I'm off. And so he walked out. I don't know which is the truth, but I've got both accounts in the book,
Yes.
But actually, if you watch Sodom and Gomorrah, it is true that the scenes that Leone directed of the charge of the Helamite cavalry and the dam bursting and they all get drowned, it's a bit like the Red Sea sequence in the Ten Commandments. It is very, very spectacular. I mean, he certainly, it's not CGI. I mean, these are real people on horses, and a lot of them, a cast of thousands and so on. I think partly because the rest of it is so unimpressive, it is the most impressive sequence in the film.
When we get to Once Upon a Time in America as well, there is this strand that you bring up in the book, especially in the biography, which is sort of becomes increasingly unignorable. It's kind of there, which is the misogyny that goes from, fistful of dollars, which you can kind of say, okay, it's a sort of retrograde, but it's of its time, perhaps. But by the time we get to Once Upon a Time in America, it's like, oh my God, I there are scenes of this that I find very difficult to watch.
It's very uncomfortable. I think, as I say, visual sophistication, movie sophistication, very aware of the latest developments in movies, but his sexual politics were very, very behind the times, I think. And it's not that in Once Upon a Time in America, the famous scene where De Niro rapes Elizabeth McGovern in the back seat of this chauffeur-driven car, it's not that we're supposed to be rooting for him. De Niro is a shit throughout the film. And one of the problems of Once Upon a Time in America is that the lead character is so nasty from the word go. And we're not supposed to be rooting for him. So it's not as if he's trying to get the audience excited by this, but he didn't realize that he'd gone much too far. That sequence goes on for about a quarter of a minute too long, and it becomes repetitive and horrible and almost unwatchable. In fact, it's the one scene I reviewed Once Upon a Time in America for the radio program Kaleidoscope on the radio. Do you remember that was submitted? It was like front row in those days on BBC Radio 4. And it's the only review I've ever done where I got a round robin of letters signed by 200 women saying, why the hell didn't you mention that rape scene in your review? Which I didn't, because they'd all gone to see the film as a result of what I was saying, and they were shocked rigid, and several of them walked out. And it is on the edge of watchability, actually. Leone claimed, that he was interested in classical myth, and classical myth was a masculine universe, and that's the way it was taught when he was at school. These days, of course, it's taught very differently. We don't just look at Ulysses, we look at Penelope, who stayed at home. She's just as interesting as a character, but not then. But that was no justification, I don't think. No, I think his sexual politics were well behind his visual politics, and it shows in that. It's a very odd movie from some points of view. I mean, for me, the scenes of childhood are the ones that work best. I think his evocation of immigrant New York has never been bettered, even in The Brutalist.
Right.
The arrival in New York and what they find. I think it's quite extraordinary what he evokes, and so those sequences, and to some extent the bits of the prohibition sections of the film. The bits for me that don't work are the rape scene, which is awful, and the modern bits set in 1968, where I don't know what went wrong, but the makeup's terrible, and you don't believe James Woods is really an old man. He looks like a young man with the powdered hair, and Elizabeth McGovern looks as though she's still in high school. I mean, and she's supposed to be, in her 50s. Something's gone wrong. It matters, because we're in three time periods: the 20s, the 30s, and the 60s. It kind of matters that you believe in those three periods. So I have slight problems with Once Upon a Time. I mean, I think some aspects of it are unbelievably good. The time shifts. The Proustian atmosphere of revisiting your past in order to try and understand it. The very first words that De Niro speaks are, "I've spent half my life going to bed early." That's the opening line of Proust's À la recherche du temps perdu. He is actually quoting Proust. I mean, you talk about parallels with James Joyce. This is all very conscious. His first line is from Proust. So it's as a film about memory, as a film about cinematic myths that don't work anymore, the Cagney, Edward G. Robinson gangster films, which you just can't make anymore. But the magic of those, all of that works very well. But some of De Niro's behavior is very, very hard to take. And in fact, when it opened at the Cannes Film Festival, you probably know the story. When it first opened, there was a lot of anger in the audience about that sequence. And De Niro had a woolly hat, and he pulled it over his eyes and stopped talking. He didn't want to be in the room with those bad vibes.
I think one of my main problem with it, and is not that rape scene so much, is that it's preceded by the rape of Tuesday Weld, which is seen as a rape fantasy. And so it's kind of almost as if the film suggests some women you can rape, some you can't.
Yes.
And that, it just feels so...
Yes.
Yak.
Tuesday Weld's character is so peculiar. I mean, she becomes a nymphomaniac who works in this brothel, and voyeurism, nymphomania, and all this. It's very, very odd. It's a very odd film in that I think it it was originally going to last about 6 hours with 2 3-hour versions. It reminds me actually of, sorry, this sounds a bit high art, but Arnold Schoenberg, the composer, once said, when opera houses tried to cut Wagner's Ring Cycle, they didn't get a short opera, they got a long opera that's short in places. And I think Once Upon a Time in America is a long film that's short in places. That there's bits of it that are almost incomprehensible. There's a sort of compressed character thing. James Woods going mad. It just suddenly happened. Suddenly on the beach, he's gone mad.
Don't call me nuts. Don't call me
nuts. And we've had no inkling of that before. And in the same way, Tuesday Weld, how did she turn into a nymphomaniac? How did they know she was a nymphomaniac? Which kind of is a context for the rape. But we don't know that before the robbery, so it becomes incredibly distasteful. And we learn that, et cetera, et cetera. So there's bits that are short in places. And I think, that like a lot of these films, it had been hanging around for years. Suddenly they got the green light, frantically cut it, the script, partly while they went along, partly beforehand. And I think there's lots of loose ends from that point of view. And there's all sorts of urban myths about there's the 6-hour version lying around somewhere. It's not true, but you always get those stories about there's a Japanese version which got an extra 10 seconds. God, fantastic.
I've just finished work on a book about Terrence Malick, and the big myth is there's a massive version of the Thin Red Line out there, and there isn't. It's just the assembly cut. If you want to watch a 6-hour version with 4 versions of the same scene, be my guest. But it's not.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not the finished film.
It's interesting, isn't it, how that happens, these urban myths about... I mean, there's a certain case for it with Leone, because as we know, his film, Once Upon a Time in the West, cut by 23 minutes, First Through Dynamite, cut by goodness knows how many, including one of the flashbacks. And Once Upon a Time in America, for its first release print in America, cut by 2 hours. It was extraordinary. They lost it completely. Like a rampant lawnmower, as Pauline Kael said, it had been cut by a rampant lawnmower. So, I mean, there is the possibility you there's bits lying around, and you do get different versions of Once Upon a Time in America. They've put back Louise Fletcher in the graveyard, in the cemetery, and they've put back some of the conversation with James Woods at the end, which makes more sense of the Treat Williams character, this Union leader who keeps popping up and disappearing. You know nothing about him in the print we've all seen, but you learn a bit more. So yes, there are bits, but some scenes were never shot, and I think it's I don't know what you feel about some of these restorations that they've restored the trilogy, and they brought Eli Wallach back.
I'm sorry, I don't know if you were involved in that at all, but
No,
I hate that scene. I hate that scene.
I do. And Leone cut those scenes himself. He didn't think they worked. So I mean, just because they've survived, you don't have to. You could have them as an extra by all means, but don't put them back into the print. Yeah. Have it as an option so buffs can follow up if they want to. But if you put it back in the print, it really destabilizes the movie, I think, with sequences. I mean, you can see why he cut them. They happen at just the wrong time. You build up all this tension, and suddenly you get a sequence which doesn't quite work.
I've got a chicken for the pot, and you've got Eli Wallach, obviously in his 70s, doing a voiceover for him in his 20s.
I know, and Lee Van Cleef sound alike, and so on. No, and also they've done something to the sound. When I remember Leone's scriptwriter Sergio Donati, who died recently, actually, saying to me that he was present when they recorded the gunshots for, it must have been a few dollars more, or The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And they went to a quarry outside Rome, and they fired guns into dustbins to get that amazing effect, so that a Colt 45 sounds like a cannon, and a cannon sounds like a nuclear explosion. Really big. These are big, and they're live sounds. But now it's been digitized. You get this funny... And when the guns get fired, it's just not the same. And, it's lost a lot of its visual, this post-synchronized thing we were talking about earlier. There's a very particular sound quality to those films, and it's very intricate and very conscious, very well worked out. Leone was obsessed. He sat in the sound dubbing studio for days, getting every single nuance correct and layering it in different ways with the technology of the time. And I think some of these restored versions have lost some of that. And I like the old slightly... I don't know. It's like I like Morricone's early scores, that mariachi gypsy sound, much more than his big symphonic sound, where he sometimes sounds like Mantovani, We won't go into that.
That's blasphemy. How can you blasphemy? But I totally agree.
But the whistling and the roughness of the early ones is fantastic, I think. But not all of that. I mean, some of the themes from Once Upon a Time in America are extraordinary, actually. But some of his other scores do tend to have a Mantovani tendency.
Well, he has an iconoclast becoming the iconic. And there's always going to be a trajectory there that's a little bit worrisome. When we get to Leningrad, I mean, it's so tantalizing in the book that you have these pictures and you have these ideas and these conversations, but in the end we have nothing. And that's
no script. I mean, frantically, when Leone died, he'd been talking about this film about the siege of Leningrad, and in particular the opening sequence. He'd been talking about it for a very, very long time, ever since Once Upon a Time in America. So we're in 89, 876, about 5 years he'd been talking about this in interviews with increasing detail. So when he died, everyone frantically was looking for a script, because perhaps we could make this movie. And so there was nothing. He made it up on the hoof. And even his scriptwriters, I've quoted them in the book, that somebody gets in touch with De Bernardi, one of his scriptwriters, says, "Where's the script?" He says, "Look, we've just got an opening sequence," which Sergio keeps telling her. It's a great opening sequence, but that's all there is. And on the basis of that, he managed to turn it into a Soviet-American-Italian co-production with millions of dollars committed, half the Soviet army, etc. He's a very persuasive storyteller. No, it's very, very sad. It is a great opening. It has, you begin with the hands of Shostakovich playing what becomes the Leningrad Symphony, and the camera goes to the left, and you see the city of Leningrad waking up, people getting onto trams, people getting on with their daily work and so on, but signs of extreme poverty and famine. And you go to the left and you go to the river, and then you see an entire panzer division of the Nazi army there, and then you go to the left eye of the panzer commander, and he says, "Fire!" and the film begins. And you think, what a sequence that would have been. Tonino Dedicoli said you'd have run out of, it was on film, you'd run out of a film magazine halfway through. You couldn't possibly do that sequence in one go, but he wanted it helicopter, one shot. So you set up this idea of a city under siege. Who are the Nazis? Who are the citizens of Leningrad? What is Shostakovich, all in one sequence before the movie even begins. It would have been amazing. And it got more and more extreme each time he told it. But, move over Eisenstein, this would have been amazing. But sadly, it never happened.
Sadly, not to be.
There have been attempts, and I had a very strange experience, which I mentioned in the book, where a friend of mine worked at the British Film Institute, and he was standing next to Richard Attenborough, who was then chairman of the British Film Institute, and a phone call came through, I imagine from an Italian production company, saying, would you be interested in resurrecting this? You've made a bridge too far. You are the man to make the Siege of Leningrad. And Attenborough put his hand over the receiver and turned to this guy and said, who's Leone? Never heard of him.
No.
And, it's a different film culture. It's a different world. Even after his death, it was a different world. This is Cinecittà, it's popular Italian cinema, it's genre films. Even then, despite the achievements of those films, somehow it's in a different world to the film establishment. It's beneath their visual threshold. Who's Leone?
We've come full circle. That's the pulp that he never quite escaped from. I mean, that's even with what we're talking about in terms of Once Upon a Time in America, the things that are disturbing about that is that even at this huge epic level, it never leaves its pulp origins. It's always going to have the cover that you're going to hide from your parents because you don't want them to know you're reading this.
Yes, no, exactly. yes, exactly. Well, again, getting back to the beginning, that I don't know what it is psychologically with me that's drawn to despised genres like that, but and it's partly because being a bit psychological about it. I mean, I grew up in a household without books, and I have this strong, when I'm writing about film, this strong thing of trying to write in words which non-specialists will understand about films that they might go and see. Now, I feel kind of guilty about over-academicizing things, and that's very much part of my background. And so I try and bridge the world of serious film scholarship and the world of people who go to the local Odeon and the people who watch it on Netflix. I try. I've done that from the very beginning, and I get very queasy about some of the technical language used by, or jargon used by film studies to be taken seriously, because it has a slight inferiority complex as a discipline and doesn't feel it's taken seriously enough by academe. It sometimes overdoes the polysyllabic words, the theoretical credentials, the footnotes, and that annoys me a bit because I kind of don't feel that. I feel, let's hear it for Leone, let's hear it for Hammer Films. Come on, they're great. They put they're movies with blood in their veins, and a lot of people have a great time going to see them. So I tend to write in that way, and so it's quite a dangerous game in a way. It does mean that you're writing about films that don't have that tradition of academic scholarship behind them. Actually, it's not so much true now. I mean, I remember in the 1960s, when I first started writing about vampires in literature, I used to go to the British Library, which was then in the round reading room, and the attendants, you get your book from the catalogue, and someone would come with white gloves and they'd sort of hand these books to me as if I was a leper. What are you doing reading this crap? So first edition of Dracula, So it was absolutely, Gothic was out, realism was in, D.H. Lawrence was in, Dickens was in, and etc. But fantasy, Gothic, fantastical, science fiction, Gothic were out. Now you go to the new reading room in St Pancras, every research student is studying the Gothic, and nobody's studying D.H. Lawrence. He's had it. It's just gone off the radar completely. So it has changed hugely in the last half century. But when I started, these things were quite difficult to persuade people to take seriously. They were absolutely against the grain. Spaghettis were against the grain, Gothic literature and Hammer Films. But I rather enjoy that, a slightly beleaguered feeling of, come on, it's me against the world. I'll persuade them. And I mean, Leone would be so amused in an ironic way that Italian Westerns are so much more fashionable now than American ones. I mean, it's completely turned around. American Westerns, you can't give them away. You really can't. Whereas Italian, the music, the clothes, the style, the hipness, the relationship to pop music, all of that, they're really hip still. Tarantino, when I did an interview with him to introduce my book on Once Upon a Time in the West, said, that film studies courses in Los Angeles, that you show them films from the golden age of Hollywood and the students are bored stiff. And then you get to a Leone film and suddenly the modern world begins for them. You don't get past Leone. It's partly the music, it's partly the style, it's partly the editing, the flamboyance, the comic book element, the jukebox musical element. All of that is there, and students suddenly get interested that their world is opening up before them. So it's a different history of film. That's great. Job done. I don't know what the next despised thing to move on to.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, because I mean, I remember when I applied for my British Academy funding in the 1990s, one piece of advice I was given was don't apply for Angela Carter. Because because the idea, not because she was despised, but because there were so many applications for Angela Carter, the vampires and the fantastic and all the rest of it had just become, it's way too oversubscribed.
Do you know my story about Angela?
No.
Gosh, in the 1970s, when I first started working at the University of Bath, Angela was living in Bath from about 72 till about 77, 78, before she moved to London, after Bristol and before she moved to London. And she was in the process of writing The Bloody Chamber. In 1974, I went on a motoring holiday by myself of Romania in the Carpathian Mountains and researching vampires. And Angela was very, very tickled at the thought of this young public school chap wandering around the Carpathian Mountains by himself. And so she wrote The Lady of the House of Love, that story in The Bloody Chamber. It's about me. And she gave me the manuscript. She gave me the manuscript. Yeah, sure. She gave me the manuscript. This young curly-haired man who finds himself... thanks, Angie. I mean, the point of the story is that the great defense against vampires is not garlic or the crucifix or holy water. It's the fact he has no imagination whatsoever, and he doesn't realise it's happening to him. Thanks very much, Angie. That's really sweet of you. But no, she was just this idea of this young chap wandering around the Carpathians and what might happen to him. She fantasised this great adventure of meeting the vampire countess and all the rest of it. Yeah, I'm the hero of The Lady of the House of Love, actually. I knew her very well indeed.
Oh, wow, what a wonderful connection.
I did a book. There's a collection of essays called Inside the Bloody Chamber, I wrote a few years ago, which has an essay about this, reminiscing about Angela writing The Lady of the House, writing The Bloody Chamber.
Oh, I should dig it out. She's one of the she's an amazing writer. I love her stuff. I love that tradition of British fantastic, from Ballard and Angela Carter.
And by the way, she loved Leone films.
Right, there you go.
I saw them with her. She loved the fantastical madness of them. That they work on the screen. They wouldn't work in everyday life at all, but they work on the screen. That's the important thing. In that moment, you believe everything. And she loved that. And she writes about it in her journal, actually.
That's amazing. Oh, well, now I've got you on the subject. The most recent iteration of vampires of Nosferatu. What was your take?
Yes. Well, I didn't want to like it. I love Nosferatu. I love it. It's one of my favorites. It's a Desert Island movie, actually. And I did the BFI, DVD. I did the extras for it. I didn't want to like it. I liked it more than I thought I was going to. I think visually it was fantastic. A whole series of almost black and white tableaus, and like The Lighthouse Men and The Witches and his other films, visually I think he's incredibly strong. I liked Johnny Depp's daughter's performance. I thought she was extraordinary, well above and beyond the Call of Duty as the victim. But I thought there were various things quite seriously wrong with it. I didn't like the Count at all.
No.
With that cod Eastern European accent and looking like a sort of, I don't know, some Attila the Hun or something, in this kind of fur-lined costume and this very, very emphatic, I am Dracula, and all this stuff, but almost as if it was artificial intelligence enhanced Eastern European accent. I thought that wasn't good, and I didn't like the prologue where you had, I can see why they did it, but where the victim, Lucy, or whatever they called her in the film, Mina, whatever they called her in the film, dreams about Nosferatu before she meets him and is a kind of sexual hysteric she's in bed sort of shrieking and having a kind of semi-orgasm, dreaming about Nosferatu. So when she meets him, it's a dream come true. I thought, you don't need that. You really don't. In the movie, the whole thing about Nosferatu is you get the strong impression they believed in vampires. It has a kind of fundamentalist quality that's really spooky. And the occult, that they kind of believe in all that. You know, most of the people who were involved in making it were deeply involved in the occult in the 1920s. Albin Grau, the designer and producer, Murnau himself, some of the actors were really into this occult craze of the mid-1920s in Germany. So they believe all that. When the professor is a Paracelsan and you get all these Kabbalistic symbols all over the letters, they all believed that stuff. You know, that's what makes it creepy, I think. Whereas in this one, it was kind of an exercise in style. So partly, the other thing was, I was looking forward to my favourite shot in the whole of silent cinema, which is in Nosferatu, which is when the ship has come in the book from on its way to Whitby, here on its way to Wismar. And the ship is gliding into the harbour with just Nosferatu on it, very slowly, and the sails obliterate the cathedral on the hill. God, that's a great moment. And it's just one of those moments where the devil has come to town and you see these sails slowly obliterating the cathedral. And I thought, oh, God, how are they going to do that? They didn't do it at all. So I think on Nosferatu, I mean, A for the visuals, A for Lily Rose Depp's performance. But I thought the Nosferatu himself was a disaster, the Count. And it didn't quite add up. I mean, slightly so what when you see it. Why do it? Slightly. You know, had it been The Bride of Frankenstein, so you say not only is it a sequel, it's actually better than the original. I didn't get that sense at all from this movie. So it was better than I feared, but not as good as I hoped.
Where do you stand on Werner Herzog's version?
Well, again, there's some lovely visuals in it based on paintings of Caspar David Friedrich, you know, a German romantic painting. It's fantastic. I think they also get... Nosferatu looks great in that, with his rodent teeth and his bat ears and Klaus Kinski and all that stuff, but he's too talkative. He goes into Lucy's room and says, "Oh, I'm condemned to eternal life, and you know you should feel sorry for me," and all the rest of it. And I thought, oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. You know, keep the mystery of Nosferatu. It doesn't say a thing except at the dinner table with Jonathan. So again, I actually preferred it to the recent one, the Herzog. But I kept saying to Nosferatu, "Shut up," you know.
Yeah, he starts saying the text.
Less is more. They're trying to turn him into a sort of tragic hero, and of course it was made at that moment where vampire films no longer had to end happily. Do you know, I think it started with Dance of the Vampires by Polanski, where at the end of the film, Jonathan is sort of, so there's Polanski playing Jonathan, and you realise that they've all turned into vampires. He's about to be bitten, and he's going to take this contagion throughout the Western world. The end, instead of wrapping it up with a nice ribbon. And I think Herzog pinched that ending for the ending of his Dracula. Remember where Jonathan opens his mouth and he's got teeth, freeze frame, end of movie. So that was quite good. It was kind of a little bit ringing the changes. But no, I think in both cases, they get the baddie wrong. In different ways. He's got to be scary. He's really scary in Murnau's film. I mean, there's something repellent about him, and also this very creepy thing of how they speed things up to make them sinister rather than slow them down. Today we go into slow motion if we want to be sinister. There, the carriage arrives, suddenly it's in fast motion. Or there, the Count is carrying his coffin across the courtyard. Speed it up, speed it up. Audiences today tend to laugh at speeded up film because they associate it with badly projected Laurel and Hardy. But, it's projected at the wrong speed. But actually, Murnau thought this was unbelievably spooky if you mess around with space and time by having someone speed jerky and speed it up. I find that really interesting, actually. But there we go. So I think Murnau still rules the roost by a fairly wide margin. Don't you agree?
No, I do agree. I totally agree with you about I like the hussar moustache, but I just thought there was a weird thing that he was so trying not to show you the Nosferatu that it got to a point where it wasn't enigmatic anymore. It was just confusing. It's just like, I don't get any sense of what this guy is or where he is or where is he in the frame even, you know. Listen, Christopher, it's been wonderful talking to you. I have one final question, which is for a film book recommendation.
Gosh. Well, a book that was very influential in my when I was at university, I contributed to a student film magazine called Cinema, and I ran the College Film Society, and I was the film editor of the student newspaper Varsity. And at that time, I was just beginning to take film really quite seriously for the first time. And I read Truffaut Hitchcock, the interview book of Francois Truffaut and Alfred Hitchcock. And I'd never read I don't think anybody had ever read such an extensive interview book before. And I think it has problems because he's constantly trying to project intellectual ideas onto Hitchcock, who resists them but takes a sideways step and then talks about the making of as his way out of it. But nevertheless, it's a really remarkable book. And it had I think every interview book that's come since, and indeed every film interview that's come since, has tips its hat to the Truffaut Hitchcock book. I always think it's rather fascinating, just as a footnote to the use of interviews and anecdotes in film studies. Round about the same time, David Niven's book, The Moon's a Balloon, came out.
Oh, such a good book.
Yeah, which is, full of absolutely wonderful Hollywood anecdotes. I mean, a lot of them tall stories, and a lot of them he claims they happened to him when they were actually folklore. You know how people tell jokes and claim they happened to them? He does that all the time. And then after Niven died, Sheridan Morley wrote a book called The Other Side of the Moon, where he points out which bits were true and which bits weren't, and you have to divide it by two again. But it's great. It's incredibly sort of entertaining and so on. So I think that the Truffaut Hitchcock recently, and it relates to our conversation, I've just read a book called Hollywood on the Tiber, which has just come out, and it's a memoir by two agents who were working in Rome in the 1960s, and it's absolutely hilarious about the film business, about Hollywood, the Hollywood stars misbehaving in Rome. Ava Gardner, you name them. I mean, Kirk Douglas. They all came over to make a movie in Italy at some point, and this is the agents. Now it can be told from the agent's point of view, and I'm really enjoying it because it's absolutely my period. It's before. It's before Fistful of Dollars, so it's sort of Dolce Vita time, late 50s, early 60s, or epic time, or the time when Ava Gardner was making The Naked Maha, the thing about Goya, terrible movie about Goya, with James Franciscus as Goya. It's unbelievable. And it's rather good that they confirm that Ava Gardner's view of the script was, quote, a piece of shit. And we all thought that, but I never realized she thought that. And that's rather reassuring, actually. Anyway, it's a great fun book, Hollywood on the Tiber. I think it came out in Italian in the 1980s, and it's just been translated and come out. So if you want a good read about what it was like to be in Rome in those heady days of the late 50s and early 60s on the Via Veneto, where every Hollywood producer in town was desperately trying to find new ideas, and Fellini was making his great movies, this is the book for you.
Excellent recommendation. And that's a book. Unfortunately, we can't get the authors on to write us on film, but we did have Sandy Lieberson, producer, who wrote the foreword to the book. He came on a few weeks ago, and we're actually planning to have a second follow-up interview because he enjoyed the interview, but he said to me, we really skipped over way too much. We've got to talk again. So,
he was actually involved in Once Upon a Time in America because he was, I forget what role he had, but he worked for Warner's in America and was seconded to this project in its early days. I once talked to him about it. I can't remember what his exact role was, but he was involved in some very, very, him and Putnam together, were very involved in lots of things. So there's quite a story with Sandy, I think. Interesting. Well worth talking to him.
Wonderful, Christopher. Thank you once more for joining me. And just as a lifelong fan, I so much appreciate your work on Sergio Leone.
Oh, that's very kind.
On Hammer Films, a pair of passions.
Indeed. Well, that's you're a man of taste, sir, and it's great talking to you.